before we do that, I'll introduce myself. I'm Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester and coordinate the Forest Connect program. One element of that is the monthly webinar series. And this is the first of three Silvopasture first of three in sequence Silvopasture webinars. I think we're going to have a couple more in the fall, but Roy is leading off with this one. Before we get into that, for those of you who would like to have a copy of this presentation, I'll direct you to the upper left-hand corner. There's a file menu, and then if you select the option to either save or save as the document, what you're saving is a copy, PDF copy of this presentation. So it defaults to a UCF file type. So make sure which most computers can't read. So select the PDF file type, and then save it to wherever you want to save it on your computer, and then you'll have any of the images and references and other kinds of things that Roy may be presenting. You don't have to worry about trying to record those. So this webinar is being recorded, and all of these webinars are available at the Forest Connect. Trying to talk and type at the same time. Forest Connect channel on YouTube. So, okay, with that, I am going to introduce our speaker, Roy Brubaker. Roy is a forester with the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, and also a silvopastoralist and a very thoughtful thinker, I think. That didn't quite come out the way. Roy thinks well. Roy creates a very good argument, and thoughtfully done and logically done, and is in a great place and position to make a case for expanding silvopasture in the Northeast. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Roy. And Roy has livestock. I don't know all of the details of this farm, so maybe Roy, you might start by just explaining what the animal side of your life. I think most folks would recognize your role through as a forester with the state agency, but maybe talk a little bit about how you bring those things together, and then your presentation. So, and also, and I'll stop here in just a minute, Roy. If you have questions, please type those into the chat pod as if Roy sees them, and certainly if they're pertinent to a particular point in time, we'll be able to answer those, but they'll all be saved in the chat pod, and we'll make sure that all of those questions are answered later, certainly by the end of the presentation. Good. Okay, Roy, it's all yours. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Peter, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. This was originally a talk that I gave up at the Silvopasture conference this past January up in Albany. But to start a little bit with my background, my wife and I do run a farm, a grass-based farm in southern Juniata County in Pennsylvania, which is slightly south of central PA. We raise beef cattle, sheep, and hogs. And I grew up on an organic vegetable farm, and I've always enjoyed the woods. So I feel like I've always sort of straddled this world of production agriculture, sort of alternative production agriculture, organic and diversified farming, and forestry, really from the time I was 12 on. And one of the things that I've always came from a third generation, my grandfather was a conservative Mennonite, never wanted to adopt the modern farming technology, herbicide, salt-based fertilizers, and that kind of thing. Was good friends with J.I. Rodale and others that sort of formed the front edge of the organic movement. And really, it was a lot of theological reasons that he used for sort of hewing the line towards natural farming systems. He read a lot of Sir Albert Howard's work coming out of India in the 40s. And so I grew up sort of with this mantra that you must farm like the forest. And as I thought about that kind of mantra in the Pennsylvania context, as I got older and rebelled against my previous generations, I remember having lots of arguments with my dad that in Pennsylvania, you don't farm like the forest, you actually farm the forest. Because I felt like even organic agriculture often did not really take into account the huge amount of benefits that forest ecosystems provide the farming systems and to society at large. So my own personal mantra for quite a few years now has been that anything you do in the northeast temperate forest, you're doing in a forest ecosystem. And so you need to be thinking about not just taking, whether it's mob grazing principles or organic vegetable production principles from California or from the Southwest and applying them in a forest system. You're really misapplying techniques that need to be tested and tried out in our forest system here. So that's really kind of the background for my sort of intellectual or academic interest in this case, and a little bit about the personal sort of sideline hobbies that they're not really hobbies, they're bigger than hobbies, but some of the stuff that keeps me busy outside of my regular job. So an overview for today. I had originally had this talk in 3 parts. I'm going to cover the first 2 parts. I'll divide the talk roughly in half, and I'll try to take some questions or stop and make sure I respond to questions at the end of the first half. I'm going to try to shorten it up a little bit. This third part, I'm going to just try to fit into this introduction here. I think it's actually the most important part of what I feel we need to be talking about when we talk about silvopasture. And so the first part I want to talk about is just kind of giving an overview of forest ecosystems, not just as we often focus on them as how much value they provide to forms of wildlife or ecosystem functions for other sort of non-human organisms. And I think we often sort of miss the point that forest ecosystems are also optimum human habitat. And if we start thinking about them as human habitat and all the forms of life support services that habitat has to provide, food including being included in them, I think it starts to bridge the gap between agricultural conversations and sustainable agricultural conversations and forestry conservation conversations, which is right where I see silvopasture lending a hand and helping you get the right types of minds around the problems of landscape sustainability or food production sustainability. And then the second part, I want to touch on some of the emerging studies and science that I think help us maybe think about silvopasture and generally about livestock production as a landscape management tool, both at a stand level and at a landscape level, that I think we have not brought into the conversation well enough. And so those are the 2 sort of headings that I'm going to be trying to fill out a little bit under. And this is kind of a strange context to be communicating in. I have a background in theater, so I always really value the kind of personal engagement that you get when you're talking to real live people. But one of the other things I've learned about talking to people is that if you offend them a little bit right at the beginning, they often listen to you a little bit more closely. So I'm making some assumptions about who might be the audience today, and it was nice to see the geographic scatter, but in terms of what your interests or objectives may be, when I've been to silvopasture conversations in the past, I noticed these types of people kind of gravitating, and of course this is tongue-in-cheek. I find myself in each of these potential audiences, but I do see the people that seem interested in the silvopasture conversation are either wealthy or retired landowners looking for options, how to take care of land, how to make the best use of the land that they own. We also have economically motivated livestock owners or grazers, professional foresters that are looking to diversify the services they can offer, government agency people, usually very busy people actually, but that are looking for ways to better serve the public. There's increasing academic interest, a lot of times from sort of generalist applied science sites, people that I always find very challenging and who I feel have informed my own thinking about this. And then also a lot of conservationists. And I guess part of my talk is especially geared towards some of my colleagues and even the side of myself that is very concerned about forest diversity, forest ecosystem health, and the potential to further degrade a resource that's already under considerable duress. So hopefully everybody's mildly offended and we're all paying attention. But that's what I'm assuming you're probably able to lump yourself into one or a couple of those categories. A couple definitions quickly. In the billing for this talk, both the word silvopasture and targeted grazing were used, and I want to just briefly give my definition of both of those. Silvopasture is the concurrent and intentional production of forages, livestock, and trees on the same area of land in a sustainable system. And notice in the definition that there's no sense of scale. You know, you could be talking about a 10-acre patch of treed grass pasture used for livestock production, or you could be talking about a landscape of trees. But the idea of sustainability and sustainable production of those three components is at heart of the definition. And similar to the idea of sustainable forest management, those of you that are coming at this from a forest background would understand that you can't really create a sustainable forest or a managed forest if you don't have silvicultural prescriptions. And in the same way, silvopasture is dependent on targeted grazing. You really cannot achieve a silvopasture if you do not have the ability to set and monitor your grazing impacts. So targeted grazing, the definition is the prescriptive use of controlled herbivore impact to achieve desired vegetative conditions. So this is really akin to a silvicultural prescription that you would use, or a forest management plan that you would use to achieve desired landscape or vegetative conditions at either a stand or landscape level. So just a couple definitions that I wanted to get out right at the beginning. Another thing I want to do, sort of by way of introduction, is some acknowledgments. I've been, as I kind of mentioned, sort of dabbling in these types of areas for quite a long time, just given my background. And it's really only been in the last probably 5 or 6 years that I've found people like Brett and Peter, and here in Pennsylvania, my colleague Tracy Coulter, who are really leading the charge and helping to create the types of conversations that I feel we really need, not just to promote silvopasture, but to promote sustainability of both agricultural production and forest management and forest conservation values in the Northeast. So I really feel I owe those colleagues and friends that are carrying on the weight of this conversation, making it happen consistently around us, a lot of thanks, and want to acknowledge their work. Feel a great debt of gratitude also to Vern Sweeney and Dave Mortensen. Vern Sweeney is the executive director of the Stroudwater Research Center, who's done just, both he and the organization have done fantastic work on forest riparian buffers that have informed the CREP and other conservation cost share practices, and really helped us focus, I think, on the value of native forest cover along our streams because of the impact they have on stream ecosystem function and the public services that provides. And Dave Mortensen at Penn State Agroecology Lab has done similar research looking at forests and woody habitat, native habitat fragments within an agricultural matrix, and the benefits that those wild areas or those forest remnants have on the agricultural production systems around them, in terms of ecosystem benefits from pollinators, mycorrhizae reserves in the soils, and all kinds of other things. So both of those people are really informed, and their research has really informed my thinking for this talk. And then finally, the day actually right before I gave this talk originally up at Albany, I heard presentations from Doug Tallamy from the University of Delaware and Bernd Blasi from Cornell, and both of them, I ended up totally overhauling many of the slides and basically pirating slides from both of them because they both helped inform my thinking considerably. Finally, I want to start as kind of a takeoff point for this talk on why I think this is such an important topic. Is from an article by Foley et al., Solutions for a Cultivated Planet, which is really sort of a survey of the research on sort of the state of global agriculture. And he uses this graphic to sort of sum up where we're at in terms of the impacts of agriculture and where we need to get in the next 50 years to begin to approach some semblance of sustainability given world population and use of landscapes and natural resources that we depend on. So basically you have these 4 fingers are major impacts that are sort of threatening global sustainability at both the national and global level. And these are the production aspects that we know we need in order to meet human sustenance goals from agricultural production. And in the course of the article, he lays out strategies for both growing the production and resilience and distribution aspects of agricultural production while reducing biodiversity loss, greenhouse gas emission, unsustainable water withdrawal, and water pollution. And in all of those, when you read Foley, you really realize you're talking about a much more sensible and conservative use of ecosystem functions, while at the same time increasing or developing more efficient systems of producing the food and fiber that we need. And I think that's such an important thing because it really starts to pull together the producers, the people that are trying to figure out how to get the goods that people need, and also recognizing that we cannot produce what we need at the expense of the systems of the planet that we depend on. So finally, in terms of acknowledgments, four really critical thinkers that I think need to be a part of both the sustainable ag discussion, sustainable forest discussion, and certainly a part of Silvopasture conversations moving forward. William Cronin's been around for quite a while, Environmental History of the New England States, a fantastic book. If you haven't read it, I really encourage you to read it. Grazing ecology, we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth, so I don't want to go into too much right now. Foraging behavior by Roy Brubaker, who really started a lot of the behavioral research on herbivore, domestic herbivores, and also wild ungulates, and how they respond to nutritional intake and how malleable herbivore foraging behavior is, both to natural dynamics that have allowed them to survive in an uncertain world, and as we'll see in Vera, have even allowed them to become agents of successional change and mediating successional change. And then Simon Fairley is a UK academic that has really done a nice job of pulling a lot of the information, these other three books together, and to my mind, sort of really being the first person in the sustainable ag world to lay out a prescriptive kind of understanding of what a sustainable ag that might meet the goals Foley lays out would look like in the UK, in the English context. He uses the British Isles as kind of his landscape and to analyze and sort of lay out a prescription for a sustainable agriculture. Really put some stuff on the line that everybody else sort of dances around and doesn't really put hard numbers to. So I give him a lot of credit for moving some of this stuff beyond the well, it's still theoretical, but really putting it into a model that could be tested. Does it work or does it not? So to get into a little bit, the real challenge, I think, the whole conversation about silvopasture in the Northeast moves ahead is nobody wants to degrade the remaining forest resource that we have in the Northeast. We all, I think, intuitively acknowledge that we still live on a largely forested landscape, and those forests provide all kinds of values that we want to sustain, both economic and public, in terms of water and that kind of stuff. But when you look at the sheer economics of forest conservation, and this is a basic LEV model, land expectation value, and if you plug in up here just a couple variables that you know you need to understand to look at the economic sustainability of a patch of forest land, and these are very kind of optimistic economic numbers. If you use a 3% interest rate, a $600 per thousand board feet for your timber products that you can get off of that forest land, if you figure maybe a $200 establishment cost at the time of harvest to protect the site from browsing or to replant or to herbicide competing vegetation in order to ensure sustainable harvesting, and if you figure a $2 per acre annual tax, you find that your average acre of forest land only has a land expectation value of about $436. If you change those variables just slightly and reduce the establishment cost, you can see that you get a $200 value bump just by reducing establishment cost. So if you can reduce the need for herbicide through some other mechanism, that greatly increases the economic sustainability of that forest land. If you get rid of the annual taxes, say you have some offsetting income to pay those taxes and just get them back to zero on an annual basis, whether it's ginseng or some benefits to an agricultural enterprise or something like that, you gain another $100 in value. But again, these are all optimistic numbers because of basically, assuming a fairly good price for your timber, and we're getting back up to that with our oak saw timber now on the stump. But for many years, it's not that, and you only harvest timber once a year. So there's a lot of variability and stuff there. And if you look at anything that's even getting slightly more realistic in terms of the challenges that we know we have in establishing sustainable regeneration in our forests across the Northeast, and again, this is still way optimistic in terms of what we're paying in our annual taxes, how much income we have to make. And you see that even just a slight adjustment to sort of realism, if you will, you really have a non-sustainable economic equation for forest land. And not surprisingly, across a lot of the Northeast, even though the FIA data shows that some regions are still gaining forest land from abandoned agriculture and pasture land and that kind of stuff, in my area, we're seeing more and more of this where thickets are being plowed out, going back into corn or into pasture, or even more commonly into housing developments and urbanizing parts of the state. So we have a major challenge that I think we all agree is confronting our forest land and our landscapes in terms of loss of ecosystem function. So, and another thing I think that everybody agrees on is the whole idea that we really cannot conserve anything without a conservation ethic. And Aldo Leopold kind of wrote the book on that. A land ethic reflects the existence of an ecological conscience, and this in turn reflects the conviction of individual responsibility for the health of the land. Health is the capacity of the land for self-renewal. And I think the one thing I would add that is often left from the equation by some members in the audience is the economic solvency. If we don't have a way to pay the bills, that a lot of times conservation will not happen. But conservation overall is our effort to understand and preserve this capacity. And I think in the silvopasture argument, understanding both the economic and the ecological components of that. And so, there's definitely things you can do beyond silvopasture to increase the opportunities, the economic opportunities for forest conservation. And my comments on silvopasture are based on the assumption that it is complementary to a lot of other things that you can begin to do as a forest landowner, as a farmer, to increase the economic potential of forest lands to contribute meaningfully, not just to ecosystem functions of the landscape of your farm, but also to your bottom line. And so things like cutting firewood, managing that timber stand to make sure that the 2% or 4% or 6% of annual biological growth a year is really being projected onto the most valuable parts of the forest that build both the ecological and economic values of that forest over time. And then other things that are just really triple bottom line type activities like harvesting deer, turning one of the major impediments to sustainable forest regeneration into a product that you use and benefit from as a family or a farmer. There's a lot of things that we need to be doing alongside of our silvopasture or our targeted grazing. And if we don't do them, quite frankly, our silvopasture is not going to work out very well either. But there's also a lot of things that we can do to integrate livestock production, understanding the types of ecological dynamics between trees, grasses, and the various classes of livestock we have available to us to reduce the cost of our farming enterprises, whatever they might be. A classic example, we raise sheep, and this is a forest riparian buffer we have between two permanent paddocks that I graze about 3 times a year. I haven't had to use any herbicide to grow the trees in this buffer because I can keep the moles away from them just by putting it, when I cross the stream, I put the sheep in, let them on this side of the stream for about a half an hour. They eat the grass down, and usually about mid-May, I bring them back in and do it again in about July. And then in September, I clean it out so that there's no overwintering habitat, and they've had very little impact on the riparian shrubs and trees, no impact on here. I have to get the dog, after about 15 minutes on this side of the bank, I have to get the dog and pressure them really hard to get them to come across this stream when it's flowing up until June. Most of them jump it. The bigger ones jump it. A few of them, if they aren't big enough to jump, they'll splash a little bit. But it's just this kind of dance between the behavioral realities of the classes of livestock and the needs that you have as a land manager. So overall, and this was the whole last part of my talk up at Albany, was really that I think in terms of meeting Foley's goals or meeting some of our sustainability goals, perhaps the most critical tool we lack as a society are landscape level practitioners within the primary production industries that are economically motivated and ecologically equipped to restore and sustain forest ecosystem services. Back when I was a kid, my dad was a Mennonite pastor. He talked about the importance of both the church and society paying attention to the hewers of wood and the carriers of water, the people that are producing those basic services for all of us. And if those people aren't equipped to not only produce those goods that we need, but to also do it in a way that sustains the earth, sustains the ecosystem services that we need, then we're probably underpaying them or not providing them with the right tools and the right equipment and the right cultural knowledge to do what we need them to do. And I think that's where the whole conversation of Silvopasture really comes in. There's a whole new tool set, a whole new set of practitioners, and a whole new way working together across disciplines to make sure that we're really looking at all the values that our human habitat needs to provide. This is a slide from Doug Ptolemy's talk that I really like, because Doug does a great job. He wrote the book called Bringing Nature Home, and he focuses a lot about the conservation potential of our backyards if we just design our suburban landscapes with a little bit more intelligence. And I totally agree with him. I think there's so much that we could be doing to reduce our residential footprint on forest ecosystems. But I also think when you leave the hewers of wood and the carriers of water, the primary producers, out of it, and you look at something like this, you also think, well, what's our scale? What's our operability of this landscape for producing food or fiber or that kind of thing? And that's why I think Silvopasture, where you tend to bring foresters, you tend to bring grazers, you tend to be people with economic interests that are thinking about how to produce that food and that fiber. You get them all around the same table, looking at livestock, forages, and trees. So Silvopasture, like nature, is an optimization system. I think it's also the ultimate opportunity for an interdisciplinary huddle. That's a term I stole from Daphne Miller, who wrote Pharmacy. And she's a medical doctor who talks a lot about how important it is in complex medical scientific issues to get people outside of the reductionist circles and to really spend time looking at data or looking at problems across disciplines in a sustained manner. And I think that's what Silvopasture provides. Finally, I think I believe that we as humans, our ability to think and to look at issues is largely, frankly, an evolutionary product of a silvopastoral existence. There's so many things that in order to do Silvopasture right, that you need to sustain sort of opposite ends of a dichotomy over the long term, and think about both sides of a seeming divide. So whether you're talking about light and shade, short-term versus long-term values, domestic versus wild processes, or species, commodities versus public goods, individual versus community, or objectives versus values, you're constantly sort of trying to sustain things that seem to be opposed to each other. So, real quick overview of forest ecosystems as optimum human habitat, and things that we need to be thinking about in order to get our heads screwed on straight to do this thing at any scale or any level. Basically, what makes forest ecosystems such optimum human habitat? It's a lot of things. It comes down to diversity and the amount of biological life that a forest system can sustain. And yet, if you ask your average person, does this look like a scene that you would like to live in? Generally, we think not. It's too dense. It's too crowded. We have a tendency to fear or have a sense of fear around a really dense forest stand. So I want to look a little bit about this, how forests sustain that biodiversity and the types of ecosystem functions that we know we get. And there's a lot of studies that have shown this, and this is again a slide borrowed from Solomon's talk. And he went into a little bit of detail on all of these studies, but basically just across the ecological research, when you look at systems, the greater number of species they have, the more efficiently and the more efficient their ecosystem is, and the more resilient it tends to be in the face of change. And so then you can start to talk about carrying capacity of an ecosystem for any individual or even the carrying capacity for life generally. And you see this relationship between biodiversity, productivity, and the carrying capacity of individual organisms within the system over time. And again, this is what gets to the resilience. And of course, we also know about ecology at this point, even though thinkers like, even as astute as Aldo Leopold have trouble talking about natural systems without using mechanical language. And, Aldo Leopold has a famous phrase of, intelligent tinkering being based on keeping every cog in wheel. And you know what he's getting at, but at the same time, we also know, I think, more and more germanely every day that our ecosystems are not mechanical. They're networked systems. They're very complex, and their resilience and the way that carrying capacity or that biodiversity is sustained in the system is based on network relationships, not necessarily mechanical relationships. So we have, but some of the sort of physical characteristics of forests that lead to such high levels of diversity are vertical structure. You have a lot of different layers. You have a lot of sort of vertical opportunity for life. You also have a lot of diversity. So this is a list in Ptolemy's talk where he has all these species of plants found in Northeast forests. And you can see how they're not all created equal when it comes to supporting. These are insect obligate, species of insect obligates associated with, this is Quercus or oak family, black cherry. And you can see that some plants have a huge amount of capacity to support diverse insect groups, and others have less so. But what you don't know is some of these with less capacity may have insect species that if you lose that species, you lose that insect species as well. And so the overall diversity of species composition, vertical composition that creates diversity up through the trophic layers, creates diversity in terms of the geomorphology of streams and soils and topography on a landscape, and of course impacts what other organisms you have in those other parts of the landscape. So this is where Burns Sweeney's work on the presence of forest trees actually has a bigger impact on brook trout than just the cleanliness of water or what's getting into the water. If you lose the trees and you lose the insects, you can still have really clean water, but you still lose the trout because they don't have anything to eat. So again, this is stuff that we agree on. It's what makes our forests good places to live for humans. But just to sum it up, biodiversity increases stability, improves biogeochemical processes, increases productivity, decreases susceptibility to biotic invasions, and I would add, in terms of the human habitat values, it also provides beauty and it protects us against both hubris and despair. And if you don't believe me, you can move to parts of East Africa where I grew up and see what happens when you get rid of everything but the humans. And you start realizing all of the ecosystem services that we appreciate here in the Northeast from our forested landscapes are now having to be done by human toil, a huge amount of water purification and other types of inputs. And yet, so it's understandable that when we start talking about silvopasture and about bringing livestock in the woods, especially based on what we know, and we start talking about taking a forested context like this to a forested context like this, even though we might identify that, yeah, this looks more habitable for people, we still, especially those of us that are concerned about forest conservation, have a certain amount of hand-wringing to do because we feel like we are losing diversity. We're moving from a system of complexity and vertical structure and species composition to a much sort of seemingly simpler ecosystem, and it's logical to expect that our silvopasture establishment therefore also means less carrying capacity and less diversity within those forest stands that we're using. It's especially critical in fragmented landscapes where our forested component is already an island biogeography to a certain extent, and we think, how much do we lose if we go into this 20-acre woodlot within an already heavily impacted landscape and do silvopasture? But those of us that are working in the forests of the Northeast every day also realize that a lot of our baseline in our forested fragments or our forested component of the landscape is not all rosy. It's not all functioning the way we want it to. And so Doug Ptolemy had this research project on 2 different thick hedgerow areas down in the southeast of Pennsylvania. One heavily invaded with multiflora and autumn olive. For those of you that don't recognize it, this is the autumn olive, the silvery type of vegetation there. And the other one, a much more native component. And his research student looked at the number of insect species in the 2 different fence rows, and not surprisingly found that in the more native fence row, he had a much higher number of species and also had much greater abundance of the individual species represented. And so when you look at silvopasture establishment in our baseline forest, not necessarily what was maybe here at the European, I think, the question begs to be asked, does silvopasture establishment provide an opportunity to increase the carrying capacity of both our existing forests and also our landscape, or does it necessarily have to lead to the decline? And again, in terms of how well it helps us to reach these goals of sustainable agricultural production, a lot of times is going to come out in terms of how it's implemented and what it's done. And so we'll come back to this slide at the end of the talk, but I think based on the habitat value of forest ecosystems, there are 2 paradigms in silvopasture presenting themselves to us. The first paradigm, being just another way to create a cost-effective production of food and fiber by capturing and monetizing free ecosystem services or parts of the landscape that we are currently sort of underutilizing from an agricultural commodities production standpoint. The other paradigm is to look at silvopasture as a cost-effective production of food and fiber as a byproduct of sustaining and enhancing ecosystem function. So at that, I'll stop and see if there's any questions before I go on. And where is the list on slide 31? Let's see, that was, okay. This list is from Doug Ptolemy's presentation. Doug Ptolemy is an entomologist at University of Delaware. And I'm sorry, I don't have it any better than documented than that. But Doug's done a lot of research in southeast Pennsylvania. He also does work down in the tropics, down in South and Central America, on insect diversity and plant relationships. Does that answer that question? Okay. In silviculture, how is overgrazing handled? Well, I think in silvopasture, basically you're not going to have silvopasture if you overgraze, or you're not going to have a very good silvopasture. So it's the grazing issue, and that's again why I think it's so important to have both the understanding of what silvopasture is and what targeted grazing is, because even within silvopasture, the time frame in which a silvopasture might occupy a given point of land, you might have different objectives for your targeted grazing practices at different points in that silvopasture's life. So if you're trying to regenerate parts of it, you may have to change your targeted grazing, maybe give up a little bit in the forage production and allow an accrual of woody vegetation to replace your overstory component at some point. But a lot of these things are happening over such long periods of time. We're going to get to that a little bit more. Why the long time frames are important. Let's see what else is here. Deer management is otherwise, in many cases, the overgrazing. Yeah, I'm going to talk about the deer issue a little bit more later on too, so I might because I think it's an important one to look at, address, and also be aware, I think, of some of the ecological components that, whether we're talking about domestic herbivore impacts or deer, may work with us to manage both of those problems, both of those herbivory impacts at the same time. Biomass production, I guess I see biomass production, firewood production, anything that helps you manage the woody, the undesirable component of the landscape in a cost-effective manner, is part of the sustainability equation, and Simon Fairley goes into that in a big way about how important it is that we find efficient ways to situate society around opportunities for sort of carbon neutral biomass utilization. Silvopasture promotes soil health. Yes, I will get into that a little bit too, especially if you start talking about mycorrhizal components of the soil. I think one of the soft criticisms I would have of some of the rotational grazing stuff that maintains grasswards in a very, very vegetative, highly bacterial soil component type things is that you end up never having the diversity in your sward and in your soil to really create sort of the types of biogeochemical nutrient cycling processes that you get when you have a higher mycorrhizal component in soil. But I'm getting way outside my expertise there, but yes, I do think, yeah, and I see Brett's jumping in there. Yeah, it definitely depends on the starting point. Yeah, and I think when you look at the component that trees and other woody plants bring, both from the flora and the fauna in the soil, you're really bringing a whole different suite of organisms into your agricultural production, your agricultural ecosystem services that you don't have if you don't have the trees and the woody components there. This is a good one from Richard, the issue of loss of plant diversity. And I guess I might kind of punt that to the end and see if we can have a conversation around that. Because that's, again, depending on the baseline, like Brett said before, depending on the baseline, that can be a potential concern. And I guess the only thing I would say to that is, number one, what is your baseline? And then number two, are we keeping that concern in perspective, given all of the other concerns that we have? And so I'd really like to bring that one up at the end of the talk. I'm looking at CJ Sloan's resistant silvopasture from agencies like NRCS. I'd like to punt that to the end too. Well, I wish we could just have a conversation face to face. Okay. Yes, I like Carl Dupolt's comment here about silviculture to help mitigate forest fragmentation, help create, and Brett is starting to do some great work on putting forests into fields, which I think is exactly the type of landscape level benefit that silvopasture brings, where we look at optimizing the use of open space, either from a agricultural production or from a overstory canopy closure, corridor migration type stuff. I mean, I think it has a huge ability for us to make better use of our landscape from both a conservation and an agricultural production standpoint. So I think it's for all of those reasons that I see the potential benefits from silvopasture adoption and more people with silvopastoral sort of leanings as a really important landscape level conservation tool. Okay, I'm going to try to keep going. Check my time here. Oh wow, I'm not going to have much time for the second part of this. Should have known. Okay, I'm going to skip down and just very quickly talk just the environmental history and the importance of understanding our mindset and how far back it reaches into sort of the medieval ages, really. And Cronin and Fairley and Vera all do a great job, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. But basically, the idea in Cronin, the impact of commoditization of goods on both European and Northeast landscapes. Once we made production by commodity, specialized production by commodity, kind of our organizational system, we really had this need to divide the landscape in ways that had never really been divided before, and to provide for these specialized production systems of timber, wool, and steel grains. And this happened from the 1400s to the 1600s in Europe. And obviously, when they started keeping people out of the forests and the subsistence agriculture, they moved them into the factory farms, but they also needed more and more food to support the population, so they punted them off to the New World areas. And what happened in Europe over 2 centuries essentially happened in about 100 years in terms of our transforming the landscape into this system of commodity production. And of course, in the 1900s, with the growth of the conservation movement, both here and in Europe, we had scientists starting to try to explain forest succession and all these other ecological systems, which at least in Europe and the US had largely been lost at that point. And the 2 big giants were Clements and Gleason. Clements, who basically argued that the primeval forest was there untouched until humans started hacking away at it as agriculture, when they started evolving into agricultural beings, and that essentially human agricultural impacts transformed the forest ecosystem into the patchwork mosaic that we knew in Europe and the US in the early 1900s. Both Clements and Gleason were working from pollen records and from observation of forest remnants. Gleason basically differed with Clements, and he said, you're not looking at some of the stuff in the pollen records, even back in these sort of primeval forest days. There's a lot of hazel, there's a lot of oak, there's a lot of other stuff going on that you're not explaining. But Clements really won the cultural discussion, and even though Gleason, sort of the ancestors or the descendants of Gleason are still winning in the science-based one, in that we're finding more and more that disturbance drives forest ecosystems. There's many different complexities going on. Our Western mindset was sort of made up by the Clements explanation, and so we started setting off areas that could be wild, that could be natural, that could be forests, and other areas that we utilized on the landscape. And that kind of dichotomous mindset is still really prevalent in the landscape. So I'm going to sort of skip down just really quickly. So I worked in public lands. A lot of our wilderness areas, public land areas, were actually built on heavily used landscapes. These are just on the Michaud where I work. These are the charcoal hearths that were used to supply the iron industry for about almost 100 years. And you can just imagine the kinds of impacts that landscape sustained, that forest ecosystem sustained over that 100-year period. Of course, today it's all beautiful recreational sites and historic sites, and we still have remnant populations of some of the native communities. This is a pitch pine, scrub oak, barrens site with lots of globally rare endangered species and moths and flowers, all dependent on a grass component and grassy openings within that matrix. A lot of species that we're trying to maintain with disturbance that need grass on our public lands and a grassy matrix for their breeding or nesting or feeding, prairie warbler and woodcock. We have a lot of vernal ponds on the Michaud, which everybody thinks of as a very disturbance averse community. And certainly there are species in those vernal ponds that you would not want to be running a skidder over or a bunch of cows through at certain times of the year. But ironically, they're sharing the same space with some species that we're finding do need a certain amount of pugging in the soil, a certain amount of daylighting at numerous levels. We have the spadefoot toad, spotted turtle, northern bulrush, all of which we're finding we have to invest time and energy trying to get the disturbance cycle right to keep those species in those communities. And then, of course, we have all of the arrested succession areas that have come back, not with the native species and the native types of successional pathways that we would like, but a largely invasive plant components that really do not provide the types of ecosystem benefits that we're dependent on. So on public lands, we're trying to manage all of these landscapes. We've made assumptions about what our ecosystem is, often with a baseline that's not the full suite of species that we have. And we have the classical sort of predator-prey and habitat cycles that inform our thoughts, but we're working with only about, half or who knows how many of the species that we actually have. And so especially when you look at turn of the century, at the advent of Europeans, we had these large herbivores in the northeast forests that were being preyed on and moved about the landscape by all of this trophic layer, except for perhaps the eagles. And if we go back even further, we had, of course, even more strange beasts impacting the successional pathways of our forests. And so, it kind of begs the question at this point today, when we've looked at all of these other disturbance factors, fire and deer and insect outbreaks and that kind of thing, with what we know about food-web dynamics, are the traditional theories the best we can do in terms of understanding the ecological mechanisms that facilitate both ecosystems, functions, and diversity? And especially in light of all of the work being done right now on trophic cascade effects from introduction of large predators in Yellowstone and other places. In Europe, a lot of this work is going on too. You really start to understand that herbivore impact, herbivore behavior, has to be factored in along with fire, along with insect outbreaks, and along with other factors that we recognize have created the forest ecosystem dynamics that we need to sustain. And so, finally, people like Franz Vera are coming out with work. And really what Vera does is revisit Clements and the pollen records that informed Clements and Gleason and early theorists about forest succession, and basically tries to come up with a theory that does a better job of explaining the actual pollen record that they were all working from. And basically his theory is what Fairley calls the donut hole succession theory. And it's basically that there were large herbivores. In Western Europe, you had aurochs and red stags, which are sort of similar to our elk, and all kinds of other large herbivores that would have maintained a large part of the landscape in this fringe and mantle type vegetation, which is grass around the outside edges, and then this thorny shrub. As you get shrubs like rose and hazel and stuff like that growing that are resistant to the herbivores, they provide opportunities for other browse-resistant woody vegetation to get established on the outside. And eventually, the thorn scrub in the middle succeeds to early successional tree species. In Western Europe, oak and hazel are predominant. Then as time goes on, and those early successional tree species do not regenerate well under themselves because it's too shaded, you get shade-tolerant, shade-tolerant trees that get established under the early successional trees, and eventually sort of claim the interior of the successional patch. And then finally, the last stage is that when those shade-tolerant trees begin to fall down in the interior part, obviously there's no electric fencing, there's nothing to keep the herbivores out of that interior, and so your herbivores can come back in and basically create these grazed forest glades, which then continue expanding out. So you have this constant sort of expanding donut hole theory, and Vera sort of proves this theory by going to a bunch of conserved parks across Western Europe and measuring the current pollen record being deposited in this type of continuously grazed, sort of natural preserved area, and basically shows that it does a reasonably good job of mirroring the pollen record of the quote-unquote primeval forest. So anyhow, today, when I started working as a service forester in Bedford County, there was a lot of hobby bee farms and stuff like that. And I had just come out of Penn State, and I learned about how deer were preventing, forest regeneration, and cattle in the woods are a terrible thing. And one of the very first things I started confronting as I went out and visited with landowners, most of them small farmers, had a couple beef cows, or were taking over a farm from a dairy farm that had been out of production for several years. We're looking for something to do with the land. And this is what a lot of times they had to work with. And this was in very, very high deer densities. A lot of times there was already continuous grazing, usually at light intensity, not a whole lot of animal units per acre. And there were trees and grass. And this was one of the first sites that I worked on. I basically told the guy, just keep the cows out of there until they need the shade. And this was my first experiment, 14 years before I really knew anything about silvopasture, of just saying, keep that forward base for the summer and then let the cows in there. And, from an ecological perspective, it's not the kind of seedling density that a forester wants, but from an ecological perspective, in terms of biodiversity and that kind of thing, that's a pretty nice patch of early successional forest. And then as we started doing our own grazing, we stopped making hay, and I started stockpiling a lot of our forage and letting the cows, the cow-calf herd, graze really decrepit summer grass. And I started to notice that when you let that grass grow until July and August, that you have all these propagules of woody-vit species that as a forester, I see as really positive signs of regeneration. This is rubus, which, here in Pennsylvania, if you can get rubus, you can usually grow oak, even at high deer densities. And, you find the hickory seedlings coming in the summer, and you find walnuts and black locust, and anyhow, on and on. And I started just making this connection that as grass swords sort of self-compete and change the mycorrhizal environment in the soil and shape themselves out, there is this constant relay between, grasses and forests in our system. In the same areas, and this is again in southern Betsy County and Polk County, where we have really, really high deer densities, I would notice certain shrubs in certain areas, like this is Crataegus, American hawthorn, which would be totally shrubbed over. And look, you would think, oh, that's never going to get out of the reach of the deer. Deer are preventing everything, all the things I learned in college. But then you look a little ways away and you realize there's shrubs over here that actually have continued to grow and are out of reach of the deer. And of course, once they get to that stage, they do what every, young person does, and they go to seed and start having babies, and they're dropping seeds down, and this clump grows bigger and bigger. And underneath that clump, you start to get these areas where squirrels and blue jays and stuff bury acorns, and you tend to find oak seedlings growing down under that clump. And when you look at a hawthorn, branching structure and thorn structure, and where the petiole of the leaf comes out, you realize that those leaves can get bitten back, but they will still have some photosynthetic material back in here, back where it's protected by the thorn, that will continue to photosynthesize, and that's what allows it to keep growing enough. You see how it's green. It's not completely denuded, and it keeps letting it put up some growth every year until it explodes past the reach of the deer. And hawthorn are not the only species of shrub that does this in our area. This is a viburnum species called blackhaw viburnum. I'm sorry, I can't remember the Latin right now. But viburnum does the same thing. And you see viburnum under high deer densities that eventually gets that leader up just from the branchiness and the complexity of keeping these little leaves in the middle. Thank you. Peter's reminding me, it's viburnum prunifolium. Anyhow. And so these are all pictures taken, and you can see as the shrubs get established, you see the fringe vegetation. This, in our case, it's rubus and greenbrier and other sort of browse-resistant shrubs that kind of keep expanding that circle. And then over time, in our case, you see facet. This is a clump down in one of our pastures that we put in the prep about 10 years ago, and none of this was planted. You can see the tubes around it. Most of them didn't survive, but we had enough regeneration in here. And in this one clump of viburnum blackhaw, I have 5 different tree species established and growing in area that was continuous grazed up until about 10 years ago by dairy cows, and also with extremely high deer densities. So this whole thing that Vera says, if you have seed trees around, you have grazing around, In some cases, and I'm not saying in all cases, because invasive species have played a major part and stuff like that, but Vera's hypothesis seems to hold, at least based on my own personal observations. So most of those pictures that you were seeing are from this one little area that we fenced out about 12 years ago. But if you look right next to it, in this section of bottomland hardwoods, it's a very, very high density white oak stand. There's some other species in there. But if you look through that stand, you see these big old wolfy seed trees that were the progenitors of that stand. And the stand's about 60 years old. And I'm not, this gets to the whole question of plant diversity, whether there's still legacy impacts from that grazing period and that kind of stuff. Again, we don't have the baseline for it. I know there's a lot of plant diversity down here. We have wild geraniums, we have leeks, we have a whole bunch of stuff that I don't find anywhere else on the fork, so it has come back. But anyhow, so there's a lot of science right now, and not to say that we can or maybe even should try to get back to a primeval forest through our grazing, but I think there is enough science from both the behavioral aspect that we can thoughtfully manage domestic herbivore impacts through targeted grazing and through silvopastoral design to achieve both forest succession and forest diversity at a landscape level. We know how to turn animals, domestic animals, from the work of Fred Provenza and Kathy Both and others, into somewhat specific weeders of plants. And so when you start looking back at that list that Doug Ptolemy provided us with, a lot of these species that I have listed here in green are ones that I know from experience my animals, especially the cattle and the sheep, will eat readily. Some of them are, this is Rosa family, so I'm assuming that includes multiflora rose, which they will browse on if I manage it in a vegetative state. I know I can get help from them controlling that. And then several of the other invasive species that we have a lot of, I can get both forage value and get the animals to eat. I have not figured out how to get our animals to eat these, but but I have found that it greatly reduces the cost of managing some of these other invasive species in both the field and forest environments that I manage, just by creating space and being able to get in and more selectively apply herbicide or chainsaw on these species, usually a combination of both, actually. So all of that to say, there's a lot of opportunities to develop skill sets. And my hope is that as we talk more about the skill set and the type of interdisciplinary skill set, that as we establish silvopastoralists across the landscape, we do find it as a tool that increases the carrying capacity. I think for us to do that, I think we need to be careful about the paradigms that we promote and the types of people that and ways that they work together to achieve their silvopastures. I think there's always going to be this tendency to focus on capturing free ecosystem processes, and I know at the Albany conference, one thing came up was acorn fed pork, and I think acorn fed pork is a great idea if you're doing it out on open ground where you're increasing the net acorn production of the landscape and allowing your pigs to harvest those acorns. If you're running them in to an existing sort of native hardwood stand, I want to keep that concern in perspective, because I'm not sure that we have a lot of other really good solutions in place for people, and there's a lot of things maybe much worse than acorn-fed pork that are happening in our forests. So I want to keep it in perspective, but I think we can do better than simply seeing the acorns being produced on our landscape currently as a cheap way to raise pigs or to create a niche market for pigs. So I think, if our silvopastoral tendencies have the effect of decreasing biodiversity at the stand and landscape level over time, I think we will run into more and more resistance. But perhaps more importantly, we just won't be meeting those goals that fully laid out as really critical human survival goals that we all need to be working at, whether it's at the local or the global level. I think if we approach silvopasture as an opportunity to enhance biodiversity and levels, I really think there's no end in sight for how smart we could get with it. And the reality is we're here. I think there's a lot of opportunity for conversation and learning. And frankly, when you look at some of the other paradigms and the baseline that we're working with, I guess my biggest concern is that we keep the conversation and keep the concerns in perspective, knowing how many other big problems we're not addressing in terms of forest conservation in the Northeast, or at least not making much headway on. So that's it, and I will stop and see what we have.
Hey, Scott, Roy.
Sorry.
No, that was perfect. So this is a chance for folks to ask questions. And I've brought Brett, promoted him as the terminology we use, from attendee to panelist. And Brett has a microphone, so if he wants to jump in as well. And primarily because Brett and I are going to be offering 2 additional Silvopasture talks in May and in June. So I just posted those dates, and you all will receive notice of that. So I'll start with a question, Roy. Thank you. This was a really good presentation, and I'm thinking about. So first of all, I enjoyed the recognition of early on. You had a slide that talked about the dichotomies that are associated in silvopastoral systems. Light versus darkness, and oh, there it is. And I never thought about it in those terms, but this is a nice way to do it. It resonates very favorably with me. I'm not sure, and it's going to take me a little while to think about how to package this in my brain. Do you have maybe other comments about this?
Well, I guess obviously I'm pretty much a generalist myself, and I guess I think in our own sort of human psyches, but maybe more even more critically in our sort of social organization, we have become more and more specialized, and the tendency to work very, very hard and with a great deal of intelligence to maximize, say, for instance, our objectives without thinking about what are our values. I guess just to take a really basic example, if one of our sort of deeply held human values is to provide security and happiness for those that follow us in our family, we know we need a certain amount of money to achieve that. And so a lot of times, again, just a very coarse, we often work really, really hard to make a lot of money, forgetting that we're doing that because we want to both provide well-being and happiness for our kids. And in so many cases, we tend to put a huge amount of intelligence and sophistication and into one side of the equation, forgetting that it is more in our how well and how intelligently we walk that balance between those dichotomies. And in so many areas of our life, that sense of bridging that gap across a dichotomy, there's not a lot of checks and balances in there to kind of keep us, especially when it comes to sort of an academic or if you're starting to work in like a production mindset or agricultural mindset, maximizing profit is maybe the most insidious kind of opportunity where we fail to recognize that profit for what or for whom are also questions that we need to maintain and balance. And I think, so when you start talking about something like silvopasture, part of the reason I think it gives people so much concern is that we've lost our faith in our human ability to do this kind of straddling act cognitively. And I think we need to have some faith that we actually are pretty good at it. If we make ourselves be good at it, it's what makes us human to a certain extent. And so I think, I haven't obviously packaged it too well myself, Peter, but I do think
I think what you're saying is, and what I'm hearing is that, and it aligns with some things that Brett has said before about managing silvopastoral systems. Recognizing these dichotomies is an explicit way to illustrate the complexity of thought that goes into managing the silvopastoral system. And it's necessary to have. I agree with you that society likes to box things up and keep them very overly simplified for maximization versus optimization. And so if people are going to go in the direction of silvopastoral systems, they should be conscious of this complexity and the need for this dichotomy in order for the system to function.
I think another way to look at it is just the importance of adaptive management and the discomfort that many people, until you really have a very good adaptive management framework in place, that and the first step of that is really making sure that all of the stakeholders' concerns are kind of addressed and reflected in the adaptive management framework. But even then, you know, the kind of patience that it takes to allow long-term feedback loops and long-term questions to be answered through careful accumulation of data and careful and thoughtful, you know, we have this expectation for very rapid feedback loops and a lot of sort of precision in our prognostication and our prescription making that makes it very difficult. And from a public land management standpoint, you know, that's what's just so hard, is to get everybody to accept that there's a lot of uncertainty. We're not going to resolve this uncertainty today. We're going to take our best step at making sure that we've recognized concerns, that we've addressed concerns, and that we're testing our assumptions in terms of how well we can address those concerns moving forward. And it just takes constant pressure to get people to accept that that is the reality that we are faced with as humans, and it has always been the reality that we are faced with as humans, you know, in an uncertain environment. So I think a lot of it is just getting us to sort of rein in our expectations for like rapid feedback loops and godlike precision on things that are tremendously complex and imprecise, and to share concerns that we work at sort of across ideological divides. It's tough, and it's tough to put in a soundbite. And I don't want to bog down the whole silvopasture conversation on a big ethics or human psychology kind of thing, but I do think it is an opportunity. I think silvopasture, by nature of what it takes to do or even to talk about, really potentially brings out the best thought and science that we have.
Well, let's. I don't want to dominate the question period here. There was, there may be some new questions, but there was also Richard had a question that you were going to delay to the end, thinking about the loss of plant diversity as an argument or criticism of silvopasture, and CJ was talking about agency resistance to silvopasture. So I don't know if you want to jump on those, or if there are some other questions that people want to raise at this point.
Yeah, the plant diversity one is great, and I think there's two things that really complicate that whole conversation. The first I kind of mentioned already is just that we don't have good baseline data. The second is that, and so like I guess one of the areas that I have some familiarity with is we have a bunch of plant sanctuaries on the show that we are trying to do intentional management around, because we know that we have species in these unique, some of them are sand bogs, some of them are the pine barrens. And one of the things that really strikes me as interesting, and when I work with my botanist and plant ecologist colleagues to figure out management systems, is just how paralyzed the conservation community can be based on their lack of cultural knowledge of what it takes to sustain some of those plant communities, those very rare or diverse plant communities. They all have hypotheses about what is maybe driving the loss of individuals and stuff, but they're paralyzed in not wanting to take any step for fear of making it worse. And that, to me, as kind of a, I don't know, dirt under the nails kind of farm boy. And frankly, a lot of my colleagues that are very knowledgeable about botany find frustrating, because, again, it's not like things are getting better for some of these plant communities. The status quo, the trajectories of the status quo are not necessarily positive. And so I think as long as, and this is obviously asking a very, very high bar for your average person that wants to do silvopasture. They make a few more bucks on their land that they paid for. And so I kind of feel like part of what needs to happen is that the conversation needs to recognize that people that own land and are paying the taxes on it have certain rights to do that. And we, as government officials or as conservationists, we certainly want to help them do the best job they can of stewarding the natural resources in there as possible. But if we don't have good information on how to do that, and if it's just sort of an abstract and arbitrary and capricious concern, and at the same time, we can't stop them from just running their cows in or clearing it and putting up a house, why are we not partnering with them to figure that out, or to just express those concerns, or help, at least help to mitigate those risks, rather than just making it sound like this is just not a good stewardship practice? So that gets to that a little bit. But I also think that we will not learn about plant diversity, the interaction between plant diversity and silvopasture impact, or even just the impact of targeted grazing, just without more research. I mean, it just has not been looked at real well from my perspective, especially not, and when it has been looked at, it's been continuous forest grazing or continuous animal impact with no silvopastoral management or intention, really. And then we use that, we extrapolate from that research to suggest that that's a really, really bad impact on plant diversity. So I guess that's all I'll say on that, unless there's more discussion there.
I think that parallel to that, and you hinted at it here, but gave it a couple of slides at least in the discussion. Your presentation was, looking at, what are a lot of the woodlands that are present in general, or that are accessible as part of an existing farm, are not pristine woodlands. They're woodlands that have a history of abuse and partial cutting and disturbances that have developed really robust understories of undesirable plants, or they're intermediate age stands that have virtually no understory to begin with. And so opening them up, I think you could develop an argument that in some circumstances, silvopasture is going to increase plant species diversity because you're adding sunlight, and you raise the notion of disturbance, ecology, and changing those patterns of disturbances would bring in some new plants. Some of them, the forage base would be potentially grasses, but would also have some native species that the livestock would be utilizing.
Yeah, and I think I think the other thing to keep in mind when it comes to plant diversity is that, at least here on the show, most of the plants that I feel a lot of concern about, and I'm trying to figure out as a public land manager management strategies to enhance, all of them, at least one of the sort of prevailing assumptions about what is driving their decline is low shade or a lack of some type of ground level disturbance. I mean, I don't know how to say other than that, because the same people that say this are very scared about creating that disturbance at the same time. But there's that reality. So this use the pointer. This is a dragon's mouth orchid here, which is a species we have on the Michaud. It's one of, I think, maybe 20 populations left in the world. This is yellow fringed orchid, so they're both orchids, and this is a nodding trillium. All of them endangered plants that we have here. All of them that have a bloom period of less than like 3 or 4 days, and we have to be out there, really carefully monitoring to catch these things in bloom. And their life cycle is so very ephemeral. I'm sorry, yellow fringed I think has slightly longer bloom period. I would have to check on what that is. But the reality is these things are so ephemeral in their habitats that the opportunities to do something around outside of their vulnerable period, it's like you could totally lay hands off just because you're afraid of hurting them, when their whole strategy is to get up, do their thing, get back into the safety of the ground, and let happen what happens. Some of our amphibian species are the same way, where they're very sensitive to disturbance at certain points of their life cycle, and yet you look at all of Jefferson salamanders that we have on the Michaud, and you look at that charcoal harvesting that happened for almost 100 years, and if they are that disturbance averse. The question that just screams out to me is, why are they still here at all in these vernal ponds? We had no buffers around these things during that century of 20-year clear cutting for charcoal. So it's again, a lot of these concerns need to be concerns. I think if we don't address them as concerns in the silvopastoral context, we don't move very fast, very far, at least with the agency folks in the adoption. But at the same time, we have to encourage the people that are expressing them to also keep them in perspective, and to, more importantly, put them in context of the life cycles of the specific plants and animals on the specific sites. Because you can work a targeted grazing regime or a silvopasture management regime around a whole host of potential obstacles with some intelligence, if you know a little bit about the life cycle of those species you're trying to integrate into your silvopasture plan. And I think Brett does a fantastic job of that in his workshops, of saying, yeah, wet area, you might want to have a way of dealing with that. You know, how are you going to manage to move your cattle around here to keep them out of this area, or to, you know, are there parts of the year that you would maybe want them in there to get some in? So, I mean, I think that has already been a part of the conversation, but in terms of, I think it's just going to take some patience and continued sort of cajoling to turn them into something other than just hand-wringing roadblocks.
Yes. All right, let's see. I'm going to scroll back and see. Okay, so CJ had a question. If you knew of any lists of trees and plants that livestock will eat in the Northeast.
I have an interesting publication that was done here at Penn State back in, I think, '81, where they went out and actually measured palatability of different plant species in I forget what the 3 different forest cover types in both. I think it was the northern hardwoods and oak, the oak hickory ridge and valley region. And so it has a list of plant species in there. It's a little bit dated, but it had high, medium, and low sort of palatability, or at least how many times this was with beef cattle, the cattle browsed them. And then Jerry Brunetti has some great lists of nutrient values of shrubs and weed species. I would have to ask him for it. I don't have a copy of that, but there's some of that information around. I think the best way to get it is to, if you have access to a fence row with a bunch of stuff in it, get your tree ID guide and see what because some of it is just learning what you actually have to work with and what your animals are like, and behaviors change. I've noticed some significant new learnings on the part of our sheep, especially, of what they will browse, and some of it's just putting them in and giving them opportunities at the same plant at different times of the year. So there's all kinds of sort of opportunities to play around with the whole palatability and animal impact on different species, whether they're species you want to cultivate because they're high value and they're maybe being outcompeted by lower value, lower palatable species. Like in my case, I know I can get my cattle to eat autumn olive, but they still prefer, hawthorn and willow and some of the other native shrubs. So, one of the things I found is if I go in and cut the autumn olive, let them sucker, and then run them in right at a very, when they're really nice and leafy later in the summer, the cattle will hit the autumn olive a lot harder. In the stump sprout spray stage, and of course at that time the willow and all that kind of stuff, they're leafed out. The leaves are not as quite as succulent in early August. So there's a whole combination of things that you can do with both your animals and with manipulating some of the vegetation to see what works. But yeah, there's some lists out there, and I can, Peter, if you remind me, I can send you that study if you want to make it available.
I think you did at one point. While you were speaking, I looked or I thought it would have been, I would have saved it, but
I think Troy Bishop was going to use it as part of his talk up at the conference. I don't know if he did then, but I know I sent it to him, and I think he made it available as material. But I can resend it if people would like to have access to that.
If you could, that would be handy. And Richard pointed out that if you provide it to me, we can post it on the Ning site where folks will have access, and we'll do I'll write up a little summary of this presentation and post the link to the archive as well.
Yeah.
So
I like Lisa's question here about the minimum acreage for silvopasturing, and I think it kind of gets at something that I meant to bring up is just, or maybe I did, I can't remember, but in the definition of silvopasture, there's no real mention of scale, and yet I think it's an important question to keep in mind, both in terms of sort of what is the economic kind of thresholds for it, and what is the what is sort of the scope of what we're talking about? Because I think silvopasture is an established area, kind of like a stand in forestry, where you're setting the objectives for that stand, that it is going to be forage, livestock, and trees for the indefinite future, and you're going to be using it to produce forage and livestock on an annual basis, even while you're managing the health and growth and vitality of the forest component as well. And I think just like with stands, there's a certain amount of lumping and splitting that you have to do. I think I generally sort of feel like it's not worth making it a stand unless you have about 5 acres. And I guess not that you would do all 5 acres at one point, but I do kind of think that to have some operability and management and economic thresholds, that at least for our context in Pennsylvania with the plots of land that we have and stuff, that kind of tends to be, maybe what I would see as kind of a minimum. But that's kind of an operational rather than a technical kind of opinion on my part. I don't know, Brett, would you want to say anything to that?
Well, I think that another important consideration for scale is the ability to allow a given silvopasture area to fully rest and recover between the grazing periods. So
yeah,
you might only have one small area or one paddock that you would consider silvopasture together with a bunch of other pasture areas on the farm. The mistake that I see people commonly making with silvopasturing is they're confusing it for like a stated loafing area where they try to connect it to all their other open pastures so that the animals can get in and have some respite from the biting flies and the heat during the hottest summer weather. And this is what kind of gave animals or livestock in the woods a bad reputation 60, 70 years ago, was that kind of unmanaged or passively managed continuous access to these kind of forest ecosystem areas. And over time, that would eventually lead to negative consequences or some negative impacts on at least on the timber component of those ecosystems. So it's not, I think the operability is one aspect of scale. In other words, just how small can you make a paddock? Well, it depends. If you have 5 sheep or 500 sheep or 2 cows or 200 cows. But you need to incorporate the silvopasture portions of your grazing system in a way that you can also let those areas recover when the animals are in there. And I think you touched on this a little bit today, but silvopasture management is very synonymous with intensively managed rotational grazing. This is not a situation where you're putting animals into a kind of a broad silvopasture area for several months at a time or until all the food runs out and then move them somewhere else. It's bringing animals in relatively high density, short or rather intensive grazing with long intervals between those entries into a given acre or a given paddock.
Yeah, that's a good. I think that's a great response, Brett. Thank you.
All
Peter,
right.
I am probably going to have to run here in a minute or so.
Yeah, no, I was thinking we should probably bring this to a close. So Roy will be back again tonight at 7 with this presentation. And if anybody's always welcome to come back and ponder what they're thinking this afternoon, and we'll have another round of good conversation and presentation then. So, Roy, thank you. This was a great presentation. I appreciate the effort that you put into it. So, and
no problem. Thanks to all of you. Yeah. All right.
So, all right. Thank you all. I'll close this out now and see Roy back here about 6:45.
Okay. Thanks all.
All right. Thanks.
Bye.